I never thought I'd find myself stuck in an elevator with a stranger late at night. It was supposed to be a quick ride down after a long day at the office. The door slid shut with a quiet hiss, and I leaned back, exhausted and ready to go home. But then the elevator jerked abruptly, the lights flickered, and the screen above the buttons flashed error in bold red letters. My pulse quickened as I pressed the buttons repeatedly, each attempt more frantic than the last. The walls seemed to close in, the air suddenly too warm and too thick. I let out a shaky breath, fingers flexing against the steel railing. Then I heard a voice, low and smooth, laced with a hint of amusement. "Looks like we're stuck." I turned quickly, my breath catching. I hadn't realized I wasn't alone. He was leaning casually against the wall, hands in his pockets, eyes dark and glinting with amusement. Tall, broad-shouldered, a dark suit that looked expensive. The kind of man who seemed out of place in a stalled elevator at midnight. I cleared my throat, trying to regain some semblance of composure. Sorry, I didn't see you there." He chuckled softly, the sound warm and unhurried. Clearly, he drawled, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Guess we'll be here for a while." I huffed softly, crossing my arms more out of nerves than defiance. "Perfect," I muttered. "Just what I needed." His eyes flickered with amusement. "Could be worse," he said lightly. "At least the company's not too bad." I rolled my eyes, but couldn't help the small smile that threatened to break through. The way he was looking at me, calm, confident, eyes dark and steady, made my pulse flutter wildly, despite the situation. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, and I couldn't help but wonder how long we'd be stuck here, alone, in the dark, with nothing but the quiet hum of the emergency lights and the dark eyes watching me with far too much interest. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, broken only by the soft hum of the emergency lights. I shifted, too aware of the small space between us, or rather, the lack of it. His eyes were still on me, dark and steady, with a glint of amusement that made my cheeks warm. "So, you work in the building?" I asked, my voice a little too high, a little too eager to fill the silence. He chuckled softly, the sound warm and smooth. "You could say that," he replied. "A lot of late nights, a lot of paperwork. But getting stuck in an elevator is a first." I huffed a small laugh, rolling my eyes. "Lucky me," I muttered, but my voice lacked any real bite. His smirk widened slightly, eyes glinting. "Lucky us," he corrected smoothly, his gaze flickering briefly to my lips, before returning to my eyes. My pulse skipped a beat at the small, almost imperceptible movement. I cleared my throat, trying to ignore the warmth spreading beneath my skin. "So, any idea how long we might be stuck here?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound casual, though my hands were still damp against the railing. He shrugged, glancing at the control panel. "Could be a while," he mused. "After-hours maintenance is notoriously slow." His gaze slid back to mine, a small smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "But I can think of worse company to be stuck with." My cheeks flushed, and I rolled my eyes to cover the way my breath caught. "Right," I muttered. "Because being stuck in a metal box with a complete stranger is so much better." He chuckled, the sound warm and unhurried. "You say that like you're not enjoying it," he teased, arching a brow. I scoffed softly, crossing my arms tighter over my chest. "You wish," I shot back, but my voice came out a little more breathless than I intended. His smirk widened, dark eyes glinting with far too much amusement, and my pulse fluttered wildly beneath my skin. The silence stretched, warm and heavy, and I couldn't seem to look away. His eyes were dark and unreadable, watching me with a focus that made my cheeks burn and my palms dampen against the steel railing. I shifted slightly, the movement small, but enough for my knee to brush his, the contact light but electric. My breath hitched, my fingers curling instinctively against the cold railing, but I couldn't bring myself to move away. His smirk softened, dark eyes glinting with something softer, something dangerously close to interest. His hand slid slightly, fingers brushing the back of mine in a movement so light I might have imagined it. My heart stuttered painfully, my breath catching, but I couldn't pull away. For a moment, neither of us moved, the air too warm, the space too small, his eyes too dark and too close. And despite every warning bell blaring in my head, I found myself leaning in, just a fraction, my breath shaky and unsteady. The silence between us was warm and heavy, each second stretching longer than the last. I could feel the heat of his body, too close, too solid, his eyes dark and steady on mine. My pulse fluttered wildly, my palms damp against the railing, but I couldn't seem to step back. Nathan's smirk softened, something darker flickering in his eyes as he leaned in slightly, his shoulder brushing mine. The small contact was enough to send sparks racing up my spine, my breath catching painfully in my throat. "You're nervous," he remarked smoothly, his voice low and warm, a hint of amusement in the words. I scoffed, but the sound came out shaky, my cheeks burning. "I am not," I retorted, though my voice wavered. His smirk widened, eyes glinting with amusement. "Right," he drawled, his tone lazy. "Sure doesn't look like it." My jaw clenched, but I couldn't find the words to snap back. His eyes were too dark, too steady, and the space between us felt unbearably small. The emergency lights cast soft shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw, the faint curl of his smirk, and my pulse wouldn't stop racing. I exhaled slowly, trying to regain some control. "You're awfully calm for someone stuck in an elevator," I muttered, crossing my arms tighter over my chest. Nathan chuckled, the sound warm and unhurried. "I've been in worse situations," he replied smoothly, eyes glinting. "Besides, the company's not too bad." My cheeks flamed, and I rolled my eyes, but the effect was probably ruined by the way my breath caught when his fingers brushed mine, light and fleeting but enough to send a spark of heat coursing through me. His smirk widened at my reaction, eyes darkening slightly. "Relax," he murmured, voice low and smooth. "I don't bite. Unless you ask." My breath stuttered, heart pounding painfully, and I scoffed to cover the way my cheeks burned. "You're insufferable," I muttered, but the words came out more breathless than firm. Nathan chuckled softly, the sound warm and amused. His fingers brushed mine again, slow and deliberate this time, testing, waiting for me to pull away. I didn't. His eyes flickered, something darker passing through them, and his smirk softened. "You could tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice low and velvet smooth. "All you have to do is say the word." I swallowed hard, my fingers curling instinctively against the railing. But the word wouldn't come. My heart pounded, my breath coming too fast, and the way his eyes darkened, his fingers tracing slow, lazy circles against the back of my hand, made it impossible to think. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the warmth of his hand, the dark glint of his eyes, the soft, almost lazy smirk playing at his lips. My pulse fluttered wildly, my throat dry, and I couldn't find my voice. I started, but the words caught, dissolving into a shaky exhale when his fingers slid a fraction higher, warm and firm. His eyes held mine, dark and steady, and his smirk widened slightly, dangerously. "Didn't think so," he murmured, voice smooth and confident, and before I could gather my thoughts, his hand slid to cup the side of my face, his thumb brushing slow, soothing circles against my cheek. My breath hitched, heart pounding painfully, but I couldn't seem to pull back. His eyes flickered to my lips, dark and focused, and I swallowed hard, my fingers curling instinctively against the railing, my voice barely a whisper. "Nathan," I breathed, the name slipping out unbidden, soft and shaky. His eyes darkened, his smirk widening into a slow, dangerous smile. "That's what I thought," he murmured, and his lips brushed mine, light and testing, barely a kiss, but enough to steal the breath from my lungs. I couldn't pull back. I didn't want to. And for a moment, I forgot all about the elevator, the stalled lights, the reality waiting outside. There was only his hands, warm and steady, his lips, soft and coaxing, and the slow, steady unraveling of every defense I'd ever built. Nathan's lips were warm and slow, testing, as if giving me every chance to pull back. His hand was gentle, but firm against my cheek, thumb brushing soft, soothing paths along my skin, grounding me, making it impossible to think. I should have stopped this. I should have pulled back, pressed the emergency button again, laughed it off like some ridiculous misunderstanding. But my hands were already curling into the front of his suit, my body instinctively leaning in, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. His breath hitched slightly at the small movement, his fingers sliding deeper into my hair, tilting my head to deepen the kiss. His mouth was unhurried, coaxing, the kind of kiss that left no room for hesitation or doubt, the kind that unraveled every thought until there was only warmth and the soft drag of his lips against mine. My back pressed against the cool wall of the elevator, a stark contrast to the heat of his hands, his body firm and solid, trapping me between the cold steel and his warmth. The taste of him was dark and addictive, a slow burn that made my knees weak and my breath stutter, fingers fisting in his jacket for support. Nathan's hand slid lower, fingers tracing a slow, deliberate path down my spine, pulling me closer, and a soft sound slipped from my throat, breathless, unsteady, completely unintentional. His lips curved into a smirk against mine, dark eyes glinting with a smugness that was both infuriating and devastatingly attractive. "Still want me to stop?" he murmured, his voice low and rough, words brushing warm and unsteady against my lips. I tried to scoff, tried to find some semblance of composure, but the sound came out breathless, shaky, and his smirk only widened. His hand remained firm at the small of my back, holding me close, his eyes dark and half-lidded, watching me with a focus that made my heart stutter painfully. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my breathing, my fingers still fisted in his jacket, my cheeks flushed and burning. "You're insufferable," I muttered weakly, but the words held no real heat. Nathan chuckled softly, a warm, lazy sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You say that like you're not enjoying it," he drawled, his smirk widening, eyes glinting with dark amusement. I huffed a breathless laugh, rolling my eyes, but I couldn't stop the small smile tugging at the corners of my lips, couldn't stop the way my body instinctively leaned into his warmth, into the steady, grounding weight of his hands. His eyes softened slightly at the small movement, something warm flickering beneath the dark amusement, and his thumb brushed slow, soothing circles against my waist, a silent reassurance, a quiet promise. The elevator was still dimly lit, the emergency lights casting soft shadows across his face, sharpening the lines of his jaw, the dark glint of his eyes, the slow, lazy smirk that made my breath catch painfully in my throat. For a moment, I let myself lean into him, let myself pretend this wasn't insane, that I wasn't kissing a man whose last name I didn't even know, that the warmth of his hands, the softness of his mouth, the low, velvet tone of his voice wasn't unraveling every last bit of common sense I had left. But his hands were warm, his lips soft and coaxing, and his eyes, dark and steady, watching me like I was something precious, made it impossible to care. I melted into the kiss, my eyes fluttering shut, my fingers sliding up to tangle in the soft strands of his hair, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss without a second thought. His answering groan was low and rough, his fingers tightening reflexively against my waist, pulling me even closer, until there was no space left between us, until all I could feel was him, his warmth, his hands, his mouth, slow and unhurried and devastating. Nathan's lips left mine just long enough for me to gasp for breath, his forehead resting against mine, eyes dark and half-lidded, his breath warm and unsteady. His fingers traced slow, absent-minded circles against my waist, grounding me, soothing the frantic beat of my heart. "This is a bad idea," I managed weakly, my voice cracking slightly, fingers still fisted in his jacket, my pulse fluttering wildly. His smirk softened into something warmer, almost affectionate, and he chuckled softly, his thumb brushing slow, soothing paths along my waist. "Probably," he admitted, voice warm and amused. "But I won't tell if you don't." I rolled my eyes, but my cheeks were burning, my heart pounding painfully, and I couldn't stop the small, breathless laugh that slipped from my lips. "You're impossible," I muttered, but the words came out fond, soft. Nathan chuckled again, his eyes glinting with dark amusement, his hand sliding up to cup the side of my face, thumb brushing slow, lazy circles against my cheek. "And yet," he murmured, his voice low and smooth, lips curling into a smirk, "you're not telling me to stop." My breath caught, my cheeks burning, my fingers curling instinctively in his jacket, but I couldn't find the words, couldn't force them past the lump in my throat, couldn't bring myself to pull away. Because the truth was, I didn't want him to stop. Not now. Not when I had already fallen this far. Nathan's forehead rested against mine, his breath warm and uneven, his eyes dark and steady. His hands remained firm on my waist, thumbs tracing slow, soothing circles that did little to calm my frantic pulse. My fingers were still curled into his suit jacket, my lips tingling from the kiss, my heart pounding painfully against my ribs. I should have pulled back. I should have said something, anything, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. His eyes were dark and half-lidded, his smirk softer now, almost affectionate, and I couldn't look away. This is insane, I muttered weakly, my voice breathless and shaky. Nathan chuckled softly, the sound warm and lazy. Maybe, he agreed, his lips brushing the corner of my mouth with each word. But I won't tell if you don't. I rolled my eyes, but my cheeks were warm, my pulse fluttering wildly beneath my skin, and my hands refused to let go of his jacket. His smirk widened slightly, eyes glinting with dark amusement, and his hand slid to cup the side of my face, thumb brushing slow, lazy paths along my cheek. You're impossible, I grumbled, but the words held no real heat. Nathan's eyes softened slightly, his smirk turning into something warmer, more genuine. And yet, he murmured, his voice low and smooth, you're not telling me to stop. My breath caught, heart stuttering, and I swallowed hard, my fingers curling instinctively in his jacket. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was, I didn't want him to stop. His eyes darkened, his smirk widening at my silence, and his fingers slid slowly along my waist, pulling me closer. His mouth was on mine again before I could think, slow and deep and unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. His hands were warm, firm, grounding me when my knees felt dangerously close to giving out. I melted into the kiss, my fingers sliding up to tangle in the soft strands of his hair, pulling him closer, needing more. His breath hitched slightly, a low, rough sound slipping from his throat that left me dizzy, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. The elevator was too warm, the air too thick, but I couldn't bring myself to care. His mouth was soft and coaxing, his hands warm and sure, and for the first time in too long, I didn't feel cold. He pulled back slowly, just enough to press his forehead against mine, his breath warm and unsteady, eyes dark and half-lidded. His thumb traced slow, lazy circles against my waist, grounding me, soothing the frantic beat of my heart. His eyes searched mine, dark and questioning, his voice soft and rough when he spoke. Dinner, he murmured, the word more a statement than a question. Tomorrow night. I blinked, breath catching, my fingers still tangled in his jacket, my heart pounding painfully. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't think, only nod. Nathan's smirk softened into a warm smile, and his thumb brushed a slow path along my knuckles, his eyes glinting with something dark and promising. Good, he murmured, his voice low and smooth. It's a date. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ding, the bright lights of the lobby a harsh contrast to the dim, warm cocoon we'd been in. Nathan's hand was still firm on my waist, his thumb tracing slow, lazy circles that made it impossible to think straight. My fingers were still tangled in his suit jacket, my cheeks flushed and warm, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. Reality crashed back in with brutal clarity, where we were, what we'd just done, the security cameras undoubtedly capturing every second. My breath hitched, and I pulled back instinctively, my fingers slipping from his jacket, my palms damp and trembling. Nathan's eyes darkened with confusion, his hand falling reluctantly from my waist, but he didn't move back, his gaze steady and questioning. Hey, he murmured softly, his voice low and soothing. You okay? I forced a shaky laugh, my hands curling instinctively around my own arms in a flimsy attempt at defense. Why yeah, I stammered, though the words came out unconvincing even to my own ears. This was. Nathan's smirk softened, his eyes warm and unhurried. A little fast, he offered, arching a brow, and his tone was warm, almost teasing. I exhaled slowly, forcing a weak smile. Just a little, I admitted, my voice breathless and shaky. His hand slid gently to my wrist, his fingers curling around it in a way that was both firm and reassuring. "We can slow down," he murmured, his voice low and velvet smooth. "We don't have to rush." The raw sincerity in his tone, the warmth in his eyes, made my chest ache painfully. My pulse fluttered wildly, my breath coming too fast, and I swallowed hard, forcing my gaze to the floor, to the soft glow of the elevator lights on the marble tiles. I should have pulled back. I should have stepped out, mumbled some excuse about being late or needing to get home, anything to break the spell his hands and his eyes and his voice had woven around me. But my legs wouldn't move. His thumb brushed a slow, lazy path along the inside of my wrist, his eyes dark and steady, and the warmth of his hand, the soft, coaxing tone of his voice, left me helpless, frozen in place, my pulse a frantic beat in my ears. "Nathan," I started, but the word came out shaky, more a breath than a name. His smirk softened, eyes glinting with something warm and reassuring. "Just dinner," he promised softly, his voice low and smooth. "That's all I'm asking." My breath caught, heart stuttering painfully, and I hesitated, my fingers trembling slightly in his grasp. His eyes were dark and sincere, his hand warm and steady, and for a moment, I let myself believe it, let myself lean into the warmth, the reassurance, the soft promise in his eyes. "Okay," I whispered finally, the word barely more than a breath. Nathan's smirk widened into a slow, warm smile, his eyes glinting with dark amusement. His thumb brushed a slow path along my knuckles, and his voice was soft and satisfied when he spoke. "Good," he murmured, his eyes glinting with something dark and promising. "It's a date." Nathan's smile lingered, warm and satisfied, his fingers still gently curled around my wrist. My heart was pounding painfully, my breath unsteady, and I couldn't seem to pull my hand back, couldn't seem to force my legs to move out of the elevator and away from him. The lobby was empty and quiet, the lights too bright, the air too cold. The reality of what just happened crashed down, and my cheeks flamed with a mix of embarrassment and something dangerously close to regret. Nathan's eyes softened slightly, his thumb brushing slow, reassuring circles against my knuckles. His smirk was still there, but it was gentler now, less smug, more concerned. "You can say no," he murmured, his voice low and velvet smooth, a question hidden beneath the words. "I won't hold it against you." My breath hitched, my fingers curling instinctively against his palm. The warmth of his hand was grounding, his eyes dark and steady, and my heart stuttered painfully at the raw sincerity in his tone. I started, but the words caught in my throat, dissolving into a shaky exhale. My pulse fluttered wildly, my cheeks warm and burning, but I couldn't bring myself to pull back, couldn't bring myself to step away from the warmth of his hand, the soft promise in his eyes. Nathan's smirk softened, his eyes darkening with something dangerously close to relief. "Didn't think so," he murmured, voice low and rough, and his fingers tightened slightly around mine, his eyes glinting with dark amusement. I huffed softly, rolling my eyes to cover the way my breath caught, but the small smile tugging at my lips probably ruined the effect. "You're insufferable," I grumbled, but the words held no real heat. He chuckled warmly, the sound low and unhurried, his eyes glinting with dark satisfaction. "You keep saying that," he drawled, his thumb brushing slow, lazy circles against the back of my hand. "But I haven't seen you try to leave yet." My cheeks burned, and I scoffed, rolling my eyes, but my fingers were still tangled in his, my pulse fluttering wildly beneath my skin. His eyes were dark and steady, watching me with a focus that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, and the soft, almost lazy smirk playing at his lips sent a fresh wave of heat racing through me. I cleared my throat, forcing a shaky breath. "You're way too confident," I muttered, but my voice came out soft, more breathless than annoyed. Nathan chuckled again, his eyes dark and half-lidded, his smirk widening. "Only when I know what I want," he murmured smoothly, his voice low and rough. "And right now, I'm looking at it." My heart skipped painfully, my cheeks flushing with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. I exhaled slowly, my fingers curling instinctively against his, and my voice was soft, almost vulnerable when I finally spoke. "This is a bad idea," I whispered, but the words came out weak, unconvincing. Nathan's smirk softened into something warmer, his thumb brushing a slow, soothing path along my knuckles. Probably, he agreed, his tone warm and amused. But I won't tell if you don't. His eyes glinted with dark amusement, his fingers squeezing gently, and the soft, lazy smile that spread across his lips made my breath catch painfully in my throat. And despite every warning bell blaring in my head, despite the reality waiting just outside those doors, I couldn't find it in me to pull away. Not now. Not when his hand was warm and steady in mine. Nathan's hand was warm and steady in mine, his eyes dark and half-lidded, watching me with a focus that made my heart stutter, painfully. The empty lobby felt too quiet, the air too thick, and I couldn't bring myself to pull away, couldn't find the will to break the silence stretching between us. His thumb brushed slow, soothing circles against my knuckles, a quiet reassurance that sent a fresh wave of warmth fluttering through me. His smirk was softer now, more a warm smile than the cocky grin he wore earlier, and it made my cheeks flush with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature. "This is crazy," I whispered finally, my voice soft and shaky, but I couldn't force myself to pull back, my fingers instinctively curling in his. Nathan chuckled softly, the sound warm and smooth, his eyes glinting with dark amusement. "A little," he admitted, his tone lazy and unbothered. "But if it helps, I don't mind crazy." I rolled my eyes, but my cheeks were warm, my pulse fluttering wildly beneath my skin, and his eyes darkened slightly at the small smile I couldn't hide. His fingers tightened just a fraction, his thumb tracing a slow path along my wrist, grounding me, keeping me from spiraling completely. "You're ridiculous," I muttered, but the words held no real bite, more breathless than annoyed. His smirk widened, eyes glinting with lazy amusement. "And yet," he drawled, his voice low and smooth, "you're still here." I huffed softly, rolling my eyes again, but my fingers didn't slip from his, my heart pounding too loudly in my ears, and his smirk softened into something warmer, more genuine. The silence stretched between us, warm and heavy, each second making the small space between us feel even smaller. My pulse fluttered painfully, my breath coming too fast, and I couldn't stop the way my fingers tightened instinctively around his, couldn't stop the small, unsteady breath that slipped from my lips. Nathan's eyes flickered, dark and unreadable, and his hand slid slowly up to cup the side of my face, thumb brushing soft, soothing paths along my cheek. His touch was warm and careful, almost reverent, and my breath hitched, my cheeks flushing with a heat that spread lower, coiling dangerously. "You can say no," he murmured softly, his voice low and rough, eyes dark and steady. "All you have to do is say the word." I swallowed hard, my pulse a frantic beat in my ears, but the word wouldn't come, my fingers still curled instinctively in his jacket, my body leaning unconsciously into the warmth of his hand. Nathan's smirk widened slightly at my silence, his eyes glinting with dark amusement. "Didn't think so," he murmured smoothly, and his lips brushed mine, light and testing, a question more than a kiss. I couldn't stop the soft, breathless sound that escaped me, couldn't stop my hands from sliding up to tangle in the soft strands of his hair, pulling him closer, needing more. His answering groan was low and rough, his hand tightening against my waist, pulling me flush against him with a firmness that left no room for hesitation. His mouth was warm and insistent, slow and unhurried, like he had all the time in the world to unravel me, piece by piece. His hands slid slowly along my sides, fingers tracing lazy paths that left my skin burning, and I melted into the kiss, my body arching instinctively into his warmth. The world outside the lobby, my job, my apartment, everything, ceased to exist. There was only his hands, his mouth, the slow, steady unraveling of every defense I'd ever built. And for the first time in far too long, I didn't want to stop. Nathan's lips were warm and insistent, moving against mine with a slow, deliberate hunger that left me breathless. His hands were firm, sliding along my sides with a confidence that was both reassuring and devastating. Every nerve ending in my body felt like it was on fire, and my fingers were still tangled in his hair, holding him close, needing more. I should have stopped this, I knew I should have. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to pull back, to remember where we were, what this was. But his mouth was coaxing, his hands warm and sure, and I couldn't bring myself to care. Not when every kiss left me dizzy, every touch sent sparks racing beneath my skin. His breath was unsteady when he finally pulled back, just enough to rest his forehead against mine, his eyes dark and hooded. His thumb traced slow, lazy circles against my waist, grounding me, soothing the frantic beat of my heart. "This is a bad idea," I managed weakly, my voice cracking, fingers still fisted in his jacket. Nathan chuckled softly, the sound warm and lazy. "Probably," he agreed, his smirk widening. "But you're not telling me to stop." I scoffed, rolling my eyes, but my cheeks were warm, my pulse fluttering wildly, and my hands refused to let go of his jacket. His eyes were dark and steady, his smirk softening into something warmer, almost affectionate. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ding, the bright lights of the lobby a harsh reminder of reality. The cold air bit at my cheeks, a cruel contrast to the warmth of his hands, the soft, lazy drag of his mouth against mine. My heart stuttered painfully, my breath catching, and I took a shaky step back, my fingers slipping from his jacket, my palms damp and trembling. Nathan's eyes darkened slightly, his hand falling reluctantly from my waist, his brows knitting with confusion, with something dangerously close to hurt. "Olivia," he murmured softly, his voice low and questioning. My throat was tight, my chest aching, and I forced out a shaky breath, my fingers curling instinctively around my own arms. I can't," I stammered, the words raw, cracked at the edges. This was a mistake." Nathan's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with something raw, but he didn't move, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You don't mean that," he said softly, his voice rough, a flicker of uncertainty beneath the words. My heart clenched painfully, my breath coming too fast, my pulse a frantic beat in my ears. I took a shaky step back, my fingers trembling, my eyes darting to the empty lobby, the soft glow of the lights on the marble tiles. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words barely more than a breath, and before I could lose my nerve, I turned, stepping out of the elevator with shaky legs, my chest tight and aching. Nathan's hand shot out instinctively, his fingers curling gently around my wrist, stopping me in my tracks. His eyes were dark and raw, the vulnerability in them enough to make my breath catch painfully. "Don't," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "Don't walk away." The words were soft, a quiet plea, and my resolve wavered dangerously, my heart stuttering painfully in my chest. His eyes were dark and steady, his hand warm and firm, and the raw sincerity in his voice made something twist painfully inside me. But the cold was already biting at my cheeks, the reality of what we'd done crashing back in, harsh and unrelenting. I pulled back slowly, his hand falling reluctantly from my wrist, his eyes darkening with something dangerously close to hurt. I have to go," I whispered, my voice cracking, and I turned away, stepping into the cold, empty lobby, leaving behind the warmth of his hands, the raw sincerity in his eyes, and the quiet, pleading way he had said my name. But even as the elevator doors slid shut behind me, cutting off the soft glow of the lights, I knew I wouldn't be able to forget the warmth of his hands, the dark promise in his eyes, or the way my heart ached at the sound of his voice. The cold air bit at my cheeks, a harsh contrast to the warmth that lingered from Nathan's hands, his mouth, the soft, coaxing tone of his voice. My heart was pounding painfully, my breath unsteady, and I forced one foot in front of the other, each step heavier than the last. The elevator doors slid shut behind me with a quiet hiss, cutting off the soft glow of the lights, the dark eyes that had watched me with too much sincerity, too much rawness. My fingers were still trembling, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears, and the memory of his hands, warm and sure against my waist, left me aching. I should have never let it go that far. I should have pulled back the second his hand brushed mine, the second his eyes darkened with that dangerous mix of amusement and something else, something softer. But I hadn't, and now every inch of me felt raw, exposed, and the hollow ache in my chest wouldn't ease. My steps faltered, my hands curling instinctively around my own arms, my breath shuddering on the way out. The lobby was empty, the lights too bright, too cold, and my reflection in the glass doors was pale, cheeks flushed, lips swollen, eyes wide and aching. Nathan's voice echoed in my head, soft, warm, a quiet plea. "Don't walk away." I squeezed my eyes shut, jaw tight, chest burning, But the words wouldn't leave, the warmth in his eyes, the sincerity in his tone, the way his fingers tightened instinctively against my waist like he couldn't bear to let go. This was insane. I barely knew him. He was a stranger, a man whose last name I didn't even know, a man I had kissed in a stalled elevator at midnight like I didn't have a husband waiting at home. Guilt twisted painfully in my stomach, cold and unrelenting, but beneath it was something else, something darker, something dangerously close to regret. I exhaled shakily, my eyes fluttering open, my fingers trembling where they clutched at my sleeves. My lips were still tingling from the kiss, my skin still burning where his hands had touched, and I couldn't seem to breathe past the tightness in my chest, couldn't seem to erase the dark eyes, the warm hands, the soft, coaxing tone of his voice. I took a shaky step forward, then another, each movement automatic, my mind a blur of dark eyes and warm hands, and the raw sincerity in his voice when he'd said my name. My fingers fumbled with the door, cold air biting at my cheeks, but my legs felt like lead, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my ears, and the hollow ache in my chest only deepened with each step. I shouldn't have kissed him. I shouldn't have let him pull me close, shouldn't have leaned into the warmth of his hands, shouldn't have let myself believe, even for a moment, that I could escape the reality waiting outside. But the memory of his hands, warm and sure, of the dark promise in his eyes, of the quiet, pleading way he'd said my name, wouldn't leave, each breath painful, each step heavier than the last. My eyes burned, my throat tight, and I bit the inside of my cheek, forcing one foot in front of the other, forcing myself to keep moving, to put as much distance as I could between me and the warmth of his hands, the dark sincerity in his eyes, the soft, coaxing tone of his voice. But even as I stepped out into the cold, empty night, the chill biting through my sleeves, I knew I wouldn't be able to forget. Not the way his hands had felt, warm and steady, grounding me when my legs had felt weak. Not the way his eyes had darkened, sincere and raw, watching me like I was something precious. Not the way his voice had softened, low and rough, a quiet promise in the dark. And as the door swung shut behind me with a soft click, I knew, deep down, in the hollow ache that spread through my chest, that this wasn't over. Not yet.